No, I've read the books. I think they're fabulous. I sort of feel I'm a mixture of the two. A bit shy and retiring, reluctantly dragged into cases, but on the other hand, it's so stimulating and fun. Tell us about Casino. That's where you were born. Your father was a country high school teacher. You were surrounded by books. He taught English and history. He quoted Shakespeare, Chaucer, Coleridge and John Donne. But it was a modest home, no telephone.
Yeah, no, Mum and Dad married when I think my mother might have been with child when they married. We took a lot of years to work that out. When I looked at my sister's birthday and the birth certificate, and we worked it out that she might have been a few months pregnant when they walked down the aisle, my mother. And but she had 4 children in 4 years. My brother and I are only 10 and a half months apart, which is just horrifying. So they had no money, and we had no. So it was very modest. We lived in little Teachers Federation houses that were provided, and I lived. Really, I don't have many memories of Casino, as I discovered when I last went up that way and toured, and the local Casino paper put me. The entire front page of the Casino paper was a photograph of me, returning home like some conquering hero. And the first question the journalist asked me is, "What are your memories of Casino?" And I said, "I left when I was 5." You know, I could remember, I could remember a willow tree in our back garden and a train line at the end of our road. Not a great deal I could remember. But we then moved to Gundagai. And I have far more memories of Gundagai.
Well, I think you said there were more dogs than people and more flies than dogs. So quite an environment. But being surrounded by literature, do you think that impacted upon your early decision to get into writing? You've obviously always been interested in that area.
Look, we were surrounded by, we could never afford books, but we were surrounded because we all had library cards. So, the trip to the library was a huge, huge thing and a weekly event. And, we were encouraged to read. But it's funny, I wasn't one of those. I hear so many writers talk about the fact that they were just mad readers. And even when their parents told them to turn the light off, they'd be reading by torchlight under the covers. And I was the sort of kid that, like most little boys, I'd rather be outside, playing cricket or, exploring the gold mines and all sorts of other things, And but really, I guess. And some people have heard the stories I tell about it, but I really think the writing bug hit me when I discovered Ray Bradbury, the works of Ray Bradbury, brilliant short story writer. And
how old were you?
I was 11.
Yeah.
And I think I read The Illustrated Man was the first collection of short stories I read. And I'll apologise, people will know this story, but I'll quickly tell it again. I read everything I could get hold of. The library had about 7 Bradbury titles, and there were 3 or 4 titles that weren't available, and they said they weren't available in Australia. And so I wrote a letter to Ray Bradbury, addressed to Random House, New York, and as I said, I don't recall putting a stamp on the envelope, and I put it in a post box. I was aged 11, and about 3 months later I came home from the little Catholic primary school I was going to, and there was a package on the kitchen table containing the books and a letter from Ray Bradbury himself saying how thrilled he was to have this young reader on the far side of the world. And what happened is about 4 or 5 years ago now, I wrote that story up, and I said that was when I wanted to become a writer. At that moment, I wanted to be a writer. And I wrote it up for American Magazine, and I quoted Bradbury, who once said that Jules Verne was his literary father, and Mary Shelley was his literary mother, and Edgar Allan Poe was the bat-winged cousin they kept locked in the attic. And I said that Ray Bradbury was my literary father, yes, and that Steinbeck and Hemingway were my overachieving older brothers. And this story appeared in an American magazine and was republished on my publisher's website. And about a week later, I got an email from Alexandra Bradbury, who's Ray Bradbury's youngest daughter, who said, my father is now 91 years old. I thought Ray had long since passed. She said, he's 91 years old. He is completely blind. But I read him the story you wrote, and I wanted you to know that you made an old man cry. And he wanted you to know that you are his son.
Wow.
And then we made plans so when I got to to LA on my next American tour, that I would have dinner with Ray and the family. And he died a few weeks before I arrived. But there was a wonderful moment because there was huge outpouring of stories, like people like Neil Gaiman and Steven Spielberg and Joanna Harris and all these amazing writers and filmmakers credited Ray Bradbury as their inspiration. And President Obama announced from the White House that the landing spot of Curiosity, the Mars rover, because Ray Bradbury, one of his most famous collection of short stories was The Martian Chronicles. And Curiosity had landed on Mars, but they named the landing spot Bradbury's Landing. That's after Ray Bradbury.
Did you ever meet him?
Never got a chance to meet him. I met the family, but never got a chance to meet Ray. I got very angry I met Joanna Harris, who wrote Chocolat, got a chance. She had a similar sort of story where she wrote to Bradbury and he wrote back. She got a chance to get to America and actually meet him, and he was her great literary hero. I envied her so much.
Your interest in crime had very solid roots. There was a period in your life where you experimented with matches and grass. There was a bit of a fire, as I recall. Can you tell us about that?
I apologise if people heard this story. I was 6 years old when I lit a little campfire in our paddock. And it had only been 7 years of drought, and the nor'easter was blowing. And the first house that it threatened belonged to the head of the Gundagai Rural Fire Brigade. And it took 15 brigades to bring it under control. And I told that story because, the town was threatened by this fire. And I told that story when I was doing an event in Wagga a few years ago. And there was an intake of breath from the audience, and a whole lot of people had travelled from Gundagai, and they suddenly realised that was me. They remembered that fire. The
Great Gundagai Fire.
Yeah, the Great Gundagai Fire. And I went back through, for the first time in about 45 years, I drove through Gundagai about a week ago, and I still expected to see wanted posters on every lamppost.
Nice segue with your desire, a brief one, to become a prison officer. You were earning 20 cents a week, I think, and you saw that the prison officers in corrective service were striking for an extra $50.
Though to get $50 a week, not an extra 50. They were striking to be paid $50 a week.
Wow.
Okay, and I just thought, that is so much money. And I announced to my family that I wanted to be a prison officer.
See, there's a common theme here. Crime, misdemeanors, and then writing. So you then the family moved to Coffs Harbour, you went to the local high school, you excelled academically, you matriculated or you were accepted into law at the University of Sydney, no mean feat. But in the interim, you'd applied for a cadetship with Fairfax. You were one of 6,000 applicants, didn't rate yourself, and then there's this beautiful description of Michael's mother running a mile to the local playing fields, waving a telegram, stating you've got the job.
I'm glad you tell that story. I cry every time I tell that story.
Such a great story.
Yeah.
What happened? You were torn then, I guess, between law and writing.
I couldn't afford, my parents couldn't afford, I couldn't afford to do law. The way the means test worked back then, they had less money when I was 18 than they'd had any time in their lives. My older brother and sister were already at university, and the means test funded them. But if you were the third child, it didn't take into account that there could be more than 2 children in a family. So that I would get no government support at all to go to university. And so I thought, I applied for journalism, and I thought if it doesn't work out, at least if I could work for 2 years doing anything, I could go back to university as a mature age student, and there'd be some funding for that. But I've managed to get one of those. Naively. Woodward and Bernstein had made journalism the sexiest profession in the world, and there were 6,000 applicants for 12 positions at Fairfax. And I managed to get
one of the 12. Do you ever think about what life may have been like if you'd been a lawyer? Not as exciting, I can assure you.
I discovered a lot. I was a court reporter very early on, and I was sent down to the courts. And what I discovered very early on is that court cases are mostly boring. There's literally loads and loads of debate and hanging around, and for occasional really exciting bits. And the beauty of being a journalist is we would get, anytime a judge or a barrister knew that they wanted to make a bit of, wanted to get the name in the paper, they'd tip you off about, you should be at court at 3 o'clock this afternoon because, I'm about to rip someone a new one in cross-examination, or I'm about to make some. And so you would get to see all the juicy cases, whereas as a lawyer, you don't get to choose. You could finish up.
It's mundane.
It's mundane. And whereas journalism, I got to see all the best barristers at work, I saw, and I sat in on some astonishing cases.
Tell us about one of them, if you recall.
Oh, I do remember. It's funny. I was telling a story last night to a barrister who works for the DPP. There was a very famous old coroner in New South Wales called Kevin Waller, who was chief coroner. And I remember on only my second day at the coroner's court, he took me to see an autopsy, which, he thought, this is going to blood the young 18-year-old. I'll take him. And then he locked me in the dirty body room for about 5 minutes. He did warn me not to have breakfast before I came down there. But sadly, there was quite a famous case in front of a jury, very unusual to have a coroner's case in front of a jury, where 2 policemen had allegedly kicked to death a homeless man in police cells. And I reported it exactly what Kevin Waller told the jury. It is your duty to decide if this man was assaulted and if those injuries led to his death. And a sub-editor dropped out the word if. So it read, it is your duty to decide that this man was assaulted. Yeah. And that this man, and so next morning I got into the courtroom, and the defence barristers for these 2 police officers demanding that the jury be disbanded. The whole case was going to collapse. And I'm thinking, this is tens of thousands of dollars I have just cost. This thing is all going to collapse because of a story that I wrote. And Kevin Waller, he ripped me a new one. He just absolutely read the riot act to me. And I couldn't get up and say it wasn't my fault, it was a sub-editor.
Yeah.
But that was my blooding in the first, and those 2 police officers, ultimately, that case, he stopped that inquest and he recommended that those 2 officers be charged with the death of this homeless man.
So you were really thrown in at the sharp deep end at a young age, and notwithstanding the smell of Lysol and formaldehyde, you persevered. You had a great career with Fairfax. And then you migrated, or you went to Fleet Street in the UK. What was that all about?
Oh, look, if you're a journalist in this part of the world, you've got to sort of understand, we live in a beautiful part of the world. But in terms of modern human history, there are very few events that have ever happened in the Southern Hemisphere that have shaped modern human history. The wars, the coups, they've all happened in the Northern Hemisphere. You can try to point to things like, Nelson Mandela being freed in South Africa. There are a few things, but normally it all. And so, if you sit in a newsroom in Sydney, and back in the days of telex machines and telex machines coming through, you'd get the ticker tape coming through, and all these things are happening around the world. And a part of you would think, did that really happen, or is there someone in a room somewhere on the other side of the world making this up? Because we are so far removed.
Fake news.
We are so far removed. And I thought, as a journalist, there were 2 great newspaper capitals. There was New York and there was London. Yeah. And if you wanted to report on historic events, on history being made, you had to be in one of those places, in the English language world anyway. And which is why, by going to London, I got to report on things like the Berlin Wall coming down, the collapse of the Soviet Union, all these sort of historic events. That you were there to watch history being made and to report on history being made, and I wanted a piece of that.
And re-establishing yourself in the Antipodes, as it were, it must have been an extraordinary journey for you. But you ended up writing features, didn't you? So it was a pretty, again, stellar career that you embarked upon.
Yeah, I finished up being a senior feature writer, which I love because I love being a writer. And it's why that when I reached the point where they wanted to promote me out of writing and make me, features editor and things like that, I refused because I wanted to write. No, I think it again, but in the back of my mind, there was always this thing I wanted to be a writer, and all the time I was gathering material.
Yeah.
All of that. From the early days of police rounds, doing the police rounds beat in Sydney as a young journalist, or the court reporting, all of that was gathering material for what was to come.
Tell us about Russia. We spoke about it earlier in the week. There was the Hitler letters, the Stalin letters, Hitler's skull, and this extraordinary tale of Michael being followed by the KGB in Moscow, where you lived for a year or so.
Yeah, I was the first, after sort of, Glasnost and Perestroika, I was the first Western journalist that gained access to the Moscow State Archives. I'd reported a lot as the Soviet Union was crumbling. I was going back and forth a lot. And I guess, there are a lot of remarkable stories I came across there. One, we discovered all the Romanov family photo albums and love letters between Nicholas and Alexandra, and all the children's diaries, Romanov children's diary. All of them were writing in English because she was obviously, an English princess.
And even pressed flowers.
Yeah, pressed flowers between the pages. The children had put flowers in there, and the bones had been discovered in Katerinburg in the mine shaft. DNA testing had yet to be done to prove that they were the bones of the family, but expectation was, and ultimately they were. It was proven. But I got to report on all those love letters and the photo albums, and to do the stories. And then there were the Rasputin files, which were astonishing, because the NKVD, which is the forerunner of the KGB, followed Rasputin around from the moment he arrived in St. Petersburg, and knew about every well-to-do woman that he slept with, every prostitute that he slept with. He was sleeping with up to 6 women a day. He was never bathing, yeah. But, the man was charismatic to the point where these women would be interviewed afterwards, and they would talk about this him in awe. So, and they were racy reads. The Rasputin files were racy. And then the big thing, the story I could never write was with the Stalin's Hitler files, because Soviet Union, or the Russians were first into Berlin at the end of the Second World War. They got to Hitler's bunker before anyone else did. Hitler and Evie Cormac had committed suicide. Hitler's body had been burned, buried, dug up and reburied. Stalin refused to believe that Hitler was dead, this great enemy of him that had cost millions of lives on the, on his Eastern Front. Just refused to believe that. And so he had 6 of Hitler's closest, his sort of Batman, his driver, his physician, all of them were arrested, taken back to Lubyanka, the notorious prison. They were interrogated for years. And it formed a collection of the greatest trove of information about Hitler ever gathered from people that knew him best. From right down to what he ate for breakfast every day, to his, fact that he would go to his big rallies and he'd find a girl in the audience that he wanted, and he just didn't matter whether she was the mayor's daughter or who she was. I want her brought to my room. All of this sort of material was there, including a photograph of the bloodstained sofa that Hitler and Eva Braun had perished upon, which had then been broken up, and the fabric, bloodstained fabric and wooden spars, had been wrapped up and taken back. And so you could unfurl it and see the blood stain. And there was the top of a skull with a bullet hole. At the time, we weren't sure. I'm holding it in my hand, and we thought it was Hitler's skull, but we couldn't be certain it was Hitler's skull. It has since been proven that it is Hitler's skull.
What a story.
And I was representing Associated Newspapers, and it was all about the archives needed funding. The roof was leaking, and priceless materials, because they hadn't been paid, and it was a failed state. So none of the staff and historians and archivists had been paid in months. And so they needed money to keep the archives afloat. So they were offering this, and we offered £1 million for worldwide exclusive rights to everything, for film, documentary, and we were outbid by the Jewish Holocaust Museum in Israel, who, for all the right reasons, wanted to make sure that if this is Hitler's skull, if that's Hitler's blood,
we want it.
We want it. We don't want it to become some rallying point. And it's only ever been put on display once in the years since then. It went back to Moscow. Those files was put on display, but other than that, it's been kept under lock and key.
All of these experiences, no doubt, established the platform for your writing. But before you published works in your own right, you drifted into very successfully ghostwriting. Tell us a bit about that. And I'm particularly interested in the story referable to the children who were sent from Europe to Australia.
Oh, the very first book I ghost wrote was a book called Empty Cradles by the story of Margaret Humphreys, who was a Nottingham social worker who established the Child Migrant Trust, and she really uncovered the scandal in the UK. You know, that in fact, since 1850 to about 1968, 150,000 British children were transported overseas out of children's homes and sent to the colonies, ostensibly to rid Britain of a future social problem. They considered these children, most of whom were from single mothers, unwed women. They were going to be future social problems, and it also would populate the empire with white British stock by sending them to the far side of the world. But it was a very cruel piece of social engineering, and we all know that book became subject of a film called Orange and Sunshine. Was the basis of that film. That was the first one.
Yep.
I wrote as a ghostwriter. That was Margarets Story, and that was in I think the 1993. I think I might have written that one.
Our lives have intersected in strange ways, and one of them is that I was retained back then to assess all the boys who've been doomed. There was a class action, and I can still recall very briefly going to Perth, and I could tell which people they were in the waiting room of the solicitor's office. Broken, crumpled men. What they went through was quite extraordinary. So that was a very important piece of work you did.
It's a really interesting thing as well, is that a sense of identity, aside from the abuse that they suffered, which is, I mean, horrendous, but that idea that so many of them discovered that their names that they thought they had weren't right, the birthday they thought they had wasn't right, where they were born, they thought they were born in England, but in fact they were born in Ireland. Their entire identity had been stripped from them to stop their mothers ever finding them. And a lot of these women put them into children's homes purely to say, listen, until I get on my feet, I'm coming back for this baby. But by the time they came back for the baby, it had been shipped
and
to the other side of the world.
To protect them from the war. The mothers were told the children had died. Yeah. The children were told their mothers had died. It was just abject cruelty, wasn't it?
And this idea, to me, and the biggest lie was this idea that they were orphans. And pretty much it's yet to find. I mean, I think in all of Margaret's search, she found one orphan. The rest actually had families and families. Yeah.
You did other ghost writing. 12 of the ghost writing autobiographies you did were bestsellers. Was that what then prompted you to take the next step into your own writing?
No, it's actually, I mean, I never lost that dream of being a writer, going back to the Ray Bradbury story. But I honestly felt, I mean, I knew a lot more about publishing by then. You know, I'd written, 12 or 13 ghost-written books. And I honestly thought, because I'd talked about it since I was young, that I would write a novel. If I was lucky to get it published, it would sell 12 copies. My mother would buy 8 of them.
But not always read them first up.
No, that's true. And so, and that I would continue making my living as a ghostwriter, because I realised just how hard it was to be successful as writing fiction, and look, and then I was in between projects. I had finished Rolf Harris for my sins.
That'd be an interesting retrospective read.
Yeah, and I'd been commissioned to do Lulu, the 60s pop star Lulu, to write her autobiography. And there was about a 3-month window, and that's when I wrote the first 117 pages of The Suspect, that first Joe O'Loughlin novel, and that part manuscript triggered the bidding war at the London Book Fair in 2002, and got sold into 20. I think in 3 hours it sold into 21 translations, and just my life changed.
It was never the same. I think I read your house was in negative equity. Oh. It was a struggle, a creative struggle, and almost within an hour or two,
Yeah.
it all came to
I've people
be.
heard. I always joke. I sort of say, you don't go. It's just 3 o'clock in the morning. We're getting these phone calls saying there are 5 American publishers bidding and 6 German publishers bidding, and I tell a story that Vivian and I was lying in bed at 7 o'clock in the morning. We hadn't slept, and by then we'd spent the money, and by 7:30 we'd cast the Hollywood film, and by 8 o'clock the terror began to set in.
Yeah.
Because thinking, oh my God, they think I can finish a novel, you know. And you know, because I don't plan my books ahead. I had no idea how that book ended. I didn't even know it was a crime novel. They had just bought this book on 117 pages based on the characters that I created. And look, it's a good situation to be in. I'm not going to take it back. But you know, every dream I'd ever had of being a full-time writer came true.
How old were you then?
That was 2002, early 2002. So I would have been 41. Yeah. 41, and I'd always promised I'd try to write a novel by the time I wanted out of journalism by the time I was 35, but then ghostwriting took up the next sort of 6 years of my life anyway.
But that gave you the skill, I assume, and
yeah, it helped me learn how to capture voice, and if I had the discipline to write on my own. I mean, ghostwriting was tremendously important. Particularly about capturing voice, you know, creating characters that live and breathe. Because, you know, the whole point of being a ghostwriter is do it properly and no one recognizes you even exist.
Yes.
You know, you look and sound and feel just like Jerry Halliwell or just like Tony Bullimore or just like Lulu or whatever. You are that person and no one knows you're in the background.
And then you wrote a ghost autobiography of a leading English psychologist, a criminal psychologist, and that was converted into who hasn't heard of Cracker, a fabulous series. Was that the impetus to then move into using psychologists as your heroes?
What happened was, you know, people often ask me whether I've ever written a book set in Australia, and what happened many years ago, I wrote the greatest ever unpublished Australian novel. And it was almost published by Penguin Heinemann and missed out by a single vote in the UK. And they said afterwards, if I'd set that same story in England, Ireland, Scotland or Wales, they would have published it in a heartbeat. We're talking back in the mid-80s here. The world's changed a lot, thanks to Jane Harper and many other writers from around the world that have convinced readers that we just don't care where you write the books, just write us a good story, and whether it's in Sweden or Norway or Australia, we'll come with you. But back in those days, in the 80s, the British would read British crime fiction, the Americans read American crime fiction, and we Australians would read whatever they deigned to send us. And so when I sat down, I had this 3-month window when I finished the Rolf project and I was commissioned to do Lulu. In the back of my mind was the fact that novel had been rejected, and I thought, okay, I've spent 12 years living in the UK. Let me write a book set in the UK and see what happens. And just had triggered the bidding war, and the rest is history.
The rest is history. So you by the way, you knocked back Brian Ferry. You're too busy on other projects?
I knocked back Brian Ferry and Ozzy Osbourne. Well, the problem with Brian Ferry, to ghostwrite Brian Ferry takes about 15 years to finish an album. How long would he take to finish an autobiography? And Ozzy Osbourne will literally wander into another room and wander back and go, "Oh, who are you?" Yeah. I mean, there's a limit to it.
You're a very patient man, but I get it. You come back to Australia and then your career just goes meteoric again. Where did you get the ideas for your 2 psychologists, Joseph and Cyrus?
Well, a lot of it, I mean, the knowledge for both of them came from working with Paul Britton. Paul Britton is a clinical psychologist in the UK who's one of the pioneers of offender profiling. He was the character that Cracker was based upon when Jimmy McGovern wrote the Cracker series. And I did 2 books with Paul, and I was fascinated by the way, I mean, he has the most brilliant mind of anyone I'd ever met. I mean, the way he almost had Holmesian ability to look at people and the way they're groomed and the way they're sitting and where they've chosen to sit in a room and whether they sneak down the outside or stride around the front. It all says something about their personality, you know.
Yeah, it does, by the way.
And he's quite a chilling person to spend time with, because when you ask Paul the question, and I have spent a lot of time with him, having done 2 books with him, and he looks at you with these piercing eyes and says, "Why do you ask?" And you think, "Oh, what is he? What is he?"
Got you under the microscope.
Yeah, no, I always remember. I love telling this story about when I started working on a second book. And you got to remember, this was a man who spent his life working in secure psychiatric hospitals, dealing with the worst of the worst, dealing with their worst. And what they fantasize about doing is so much worse than many of the things they've done. That stuff, their fantasies, you know, feed these things. And so he'd get home and he'd just want to turn off that, and he'd watch the most mindless TV show on TV and not go out to the pub. And he just wanted to turn off. And when I started working on the second book, he'd always, every time I'd been up to his house in Market Harborough, he'd always had Marilyn and the 2 kids were there, and then Marilyn and the kids weren't there. And there's this thing with, you know, the Red Dragon series, the Will Graham character that Thomas Harris created. The reason Will Graham was such a brilliant profiler was because he was so close to being a psychopath himself. He recognized, you know, those things. And so the big thing with Paul Britton was you always wondered, is the reason he's so good at this? You know? So at some point I just sort of said to him, "So Paul, where are Marilyn and the kids? Have you buried them in the garden?" And he just looked at me with a piercing eye and says, "Why do you ask?"
I assume they were seen again.
Yes, I told that story in Auckland at an event in New Zealand. I was touring New Zealand, and this strapping young bloke came up to get a book signed at the end, and he said, do you recognise me? And I said, "You are so familiar." I said, "You." He said, "I'm Paul Britton's son." And he had, obviously, I remember him as like a 12, 13-year-old, and he'd become a psychologist himself, and he'd emigrated to New Zealand. And I remember saying, "I'm so sorry I told that story about your dad." And he said, "Dad would love it."
It's a great story. We spoke about the Parramatta Tunnel, at Parramatta Jail Tunnel. My background is I started as a psychologist in '78 at Parramatta Jail, and there was a notorious story of a bunch of the worst criminals in New South Wales who had dug a tunnel through the catacombs, and they were due to get out. And I was struck because you mentioned that you saw this article. It involved Tony Lanigan, a bad boy. They nearly got out, but one of the Murphy brothers, Anita Cobby's killers, had rung his mother. He'd insisted on being part of the scheme, or he's going to dob the blokes in, and they accepted him. And he said, "Set a big table for dinner tomorrow night. I'll be home with a few of my mates." And that's what got them looking for the tunnel. It was discovered. I was half my body weight, and I managed to get through it. Natural curiosity. But you saw that article too, and it acted as a prompt for you.
Well, I saw an article that I discovered that about Tony Lanigan later. But what happened was the book I won the Dagger for, the first book was Life or Death, and it's about a man who escapes from prison the day before he's due to be released. And the seed of that was in 1995, March the 20th, 1995. I read a very small article in the Herald about a man who escaped from prison the day before he's due to be released, and it was Tony Lanigan.
Yes.
And what had happened is several years or a year or so earlier, Tony Lanigan had escaped before he's due to be released, spent a night under the stars up in the mountains, and waved down a paddy wagon the next day and gave himself up, and he went back to prison. And so when he escaped again, just prior to his release, nobody bothered reporting him missing because they figured he'd be back tomorrow. He'd be back tomorrow. Tony will come back. And Tony's never been seen since. He disappeared off the face of the earth, and he's regarded as Australia's least most wanted man because he'd become a model prisoner by then. But he was involved in this tunnel. You're absolutely right. He was one of the escapees on this tunnel.
And he was a terrible crook back then.
Yeah. Well, he was a 2 times killer. I mean, he'd killed, served a life sentence, and then killed again within 3 months of getting out and gone back in. Yeah. So he's a very bad man, but he's never been seen. he vanished off the face of the earth. And some people think it's because someone, they think he tipped off. I've heard rumours that he tipped them off about the tunnel, and that's the way they discovered it, and that's why someone had to kill him. And I've also heard rumours he's sipping pina coladas in the islands somewhere, and free as a bird. No one knows.
He was an interesting guy. They were all very bad people. We're running out of time a little bit, but I'm very interested in recent years in writing. Joseph has gone, Cyrus has emerged. What's the process there?
Oh, look, I think Joe O'Loughlin, I never intended to write a series with Joe, which is by giving him early onset Parkinson's in that first book and setting it in real time and aging him in real time. Anyone who knows anything about Parkinson's, the disease was going to progress. And I knew that I couldn't keep that going. And so I wanted to explore something new. And so I created a new character in Cyrus. And again, I wasn't quite sure how many books there'd be in him, because really the new character that I wanted most was Evie Cormac.
She's fascinating.
The young damaged teenage girl that's in Good Girl, Bad Girl, and then in When She Was Good. And as that sort of, and I don't know how long those, I'm doing a standalone now for next year, but then I'll go back to Evie and Cyrus the year after. And for those people who wonder whether Joe is in the frame, I did sort of throw out there, anyone that read Good Girl, Bad Girl might remember on the very last page, there's a little shout out to Joe O'Loughlin where Cyrus talks about an old university professor of mine, Joe O'Loughlin, just to let people know he's not gone. Yeah. And there's a possibility that I can bring Joe back, and maybe with Cyrus, but like Michael Connolly did when he created Mickey Haller, the Lincoln lawyer, and he's brought Mickey Haller and Bosch back together in different books, and so it's possible.
Do you think that far ahead? Or?
No. every book I'm convinced will be the last book.
Yeah.
I sign every book to my agent with the same message. Dear Mark, we've fooled them again. In the hope that each one I'm thinking this is the one that's going to expose me as a complete fraud, and it might be the last one. So we'll just keep going.
The Cabana of Cruelty, the place where you write these days. Just share with us, if you can, a bit of the process of writing. Do you write every day? Do you have a break between sending off a manuscript and starting a new one?
Yeah, I have a break of about 25 minutes. I will literally follow my wife around the house saying, that's it, I've run out of ideas. Every good one-line or every good description, it's gone. I'm an empty vessel. I'm going to have to get a proper job. I've got nothing. I'm empty. And she'll get fed up and go, just go and clean up your office then, stop hassling me. And she'll find me an hour later and I'll go, I've had an idea, and I will literally start work on something new.
Do you handwrite or type? Because I read somewhere you do it.
I handwrite. I write longhand initially, but only for 2 or 3 days, because then my handwriting's so poor I have to put it in a computer, otherwise I won't be able to read what I've written. Yeah. But first draft is all handwritten and that allows me to get away into cafes or outside or just away from the internet. Internet, greatest tool we've ever discovered for writers, but also the greatest waste of time. Yeah.
We're about at the point where people can start sending in Zoom questions if they want. Michael, it's been a great journey, all too brief really, but there's so much to cover. What a fascinating life you've had. So why don't we thank Michael now? We'll take some questions and thank him again.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. So, look, we're not handing out the microphone because we're COVID safe here at the New South Wales State Library, but if you just stand up, speak loudly and clearly, off you go. Any questions?
They're all shy.
I think the lady at the back would like to ask us a question.
Well, now it's interesting. Now I've got publishers falling over themselves wanting me to get that novel out. And Look, I think I will. But while it stays in my bottom drawer, it will always be Australia's greatest ever unpublished novel. Once I get it out, it just, all bets are off. But no, I think I will. I think I will revisit it. I'm really pleased the world's moved on, and and look, I'm really pleased. It's one of the great things about winning the Dagger last week. The Gold Dagger was, to be able to me, it's just a testament to how far Australian crime writing has come and how many brilliant writers we have. And, Jane Harper has to be given a lot of credit for blowing it, basically bringing, Australia to the world in terms of that. Because even though, I'd done very well successfully, my books were set in the UK, she proved that you could set a book in Australia, and have huge international success. And we have so many brilliant new writers coming through. And I think it's funny, I remember talking to Jo Nesbo, and he talked about when it came to that sort of Nordic noir or Scandi noir thing, he said that he felt as though he was standing on the shoulders of giants, that there were so many people that came before him that opened up that world, and I feel that all of the, I'm not calling myself a giant, but I feel as everyone that comes from now on, they can build upon what current writers are doing, and we'll just get, Australian. It's not so much that we're coming, I think we're here, when it comes to Australian writing.
I've got one question, my question, then we'll go to Fiona. Does your mother still put your books at the end of the queue before she gets to yours?
Yeah, my mother. I loved. I told this story when I won my first Dagger. I told the story of my mother who, when sadly my mother's got dementia now, so she has to put she can't. It's the same book that she reads over and over again now. But but when I gave her my first ever novel, the advanced reading copy, I gave it to her to read, and I waited and I waited and I waited, and I finally rang her and I said, "Mum, do you get a chance to read that book with my name in huge type on the front?" "Oh dear, I had 3 library books to get through. Did you want me to read your one first?" And I said, "No, Mum, honestly, when you get to it, that's fine." And when she finally read it, and I had phoned her and said, "Mum, what did you think?" "It took me a while to get into, but then I did."
That was it?
That was it. So I put that on my website underneath the Washington Post review and the Sunday Times review. Author's mother. Took me a while to get into, but then I did. And what I love most was when she then said, "What are you going to do now, dear?" I said, "Well, Mum, this is sold into 25 languages, and they want me to write another one." She said, "Oh, do you think that's wise? Perhaps you should rest on your laurels." And I remember I collected that Dagger Award note holding up saying, "Mum, I didn't rest on my laurels." I mean, it's lovely. Well, and it's funny when I got to tell you a quick story about that. I came off stage. I had no idea that J.K. Rowling was in the room because she was on the shortlist that year. Because I was up against Stephen King and Robert Galbraith, and it was a stellar shortlist. And everyone's congratulating me, and someone grabbed my arm. It was a big sort of black tie event at the Guildhall in London, and dragged me through the crowd saying, "Joe wants to meet you, Joe wants to meet you, Joe." And I finally got really irritated at this person. I turned around and said, "Who the fuck is Joe?" Just as the crowd parted. And I had to just say, "I am so, so sorry." And all she wanted to tell me was congratulate me and say that your mother and my mother sound exactly alike.
All mothers. This is a question from Fiona in cyberspace. How much do you plot a novel before you start writing?
Yeah, I'm not a plotter. I come up with a premise. Like I mentioned, a man escapes from jail the day before he's due to be released. Open with a man escaping from prison and just let it go. And I love that. I love that organic way of writing. When I come in from my cabana and say to my wife, "You would not believe what just happened," it's that sort of exciting. I surprise myself. Whereas I think this idea of, there are some writers, and I think that everyone's got their own way of doing these things. There are some writers that plot it all out in advance. But the idea that I would know what I was going to be writing next Wednesday at 3 o'clock, I couldn't live like that. I want to be surprised, and I want to discover things, and I think that the only problem being that when it's very tense and my characters are in great danger, I'm there with them, so I don't sleep, and I don't know how to save them, and so you have to live with that, because you don't know how to get them out of it. But it's also one hell of a ride.
One hell of a ride. Well, I guess that goes back in part to the ghostwriting and just becoming anonymous. You assume the character that you're writing about.
Yeah, I'm always a bit sort of wary of whenever I hear writers talk about the fact they just create the characters and the characters go off on their own. I mean, it's a bit like, that's like voices in your head. I have these voices, idea in my head, and I sort of imagine that the men with straitjackets are coming in the van to lock me up when I start talking about. I mean, because it is. Let's face it. I mean, being a writer. I mean, when it comes to these psychopaths and sociopaths, they have this incredibly rich fantasy life, which they have to feed from the real world, and they pull these things in, and this fantasy life is so vivid. And in a sense, writers create this incredibly rich fantasy life in their heads where we can sleep who we want to sleep with, we can punish who we want to punish, we can do. I mean, there are not that many differences between
real life and fiction and
real
psychopathy.
Psychopaths and authors, yeah.
We must talk. It's the skill of the psychologist and a brilliant writer. We might take a question from the floor. There's a few more cyberspace ones, but yes, I'll repeat the question because we need to get it on Zoom. So you give the question, please.
Michael, I really enjoyed your talk. You mentioned Ray Bradbury being a massive influence. I love Ray Bradbury myself. Absolutely great. Who was your favourite, or who are some of your favourite crime authors?
I'll just repeat the question. You love Ray Bradbury. You love Michael's work. Who are some of Michael's favourite crime authors?
Oh, that's so hard. Because the thing is, it's a beautiful community, the crime writing community. Because I know so many of them now. I mean, Stephen King has been incredibly good to me, through my career. I've never met the man, I've emailed him, but, time and time again, every time I write a book, Stephen King is one of the first people to read it and blurb about it. And I'm a big Stephen King fan, not of his horror stuff because I scare easily. As I always say, my mother's son. My mother once screamed so loudly in a cinema they stopped the film and turned the lights up. That's me. But no, I mean, look, James Lee Burke. I mean, there are some wonderful prose stylists, John le Carre. I mean, I've got so many, but there are also a lot of writers that are friends of mine now. I mean, there are certain books. I fall in love with a certain book because I was once famously misquoted in my very first ever newspaper interview. And the headline read, "The crime writer who's only read one crime novel." That's not what I said. I said I'd tried to read one of each. I'd read one Grisham and I'd read one Connolly and one Rankin, because I read so widely, and I love it's one of my great rules for reading is that if, let's say, you only read crime fiction once a year, you should pick up something you wouldn't normally read, not just anything, but just pick up something that everyone's raving about, whether it be fantasy or poetry but broaden. I mean, this is where you discover things that are new, because one of the hardest ways to launch new writers in any genre is that when you walk into a bookstore, into a library, even if the last 5 Patricia Cornwell books disappointed you, you're still more likely to pick up the new Patricia Cornwell than you are to try someone new. And the whole point is try someone new, because that's how you discover new favourite authors.
And it helps the market. This one's from Sharon. Do you find it hard to write as a younger man, tattooed Cyrus rather than the older Joe? And what are you writing now?
It's interesting. I mean, the hardest thing, the greatest challenge for me, I mean, I write, as everyone knows, a lot in the first person, which is unusual for crime writers to do, because it makes it very difficult when it comes to plotting. You can't, unless you're Harlan Coben, you can't just suddenly drop into third person and invent some scene to make your plot work. But to me, as a ghostwriter, I at times had to channel, different people. Jerry Halliwell was 26 when I started working with her on her autobiography. And to me, the great challenge is to write, the Secret She Keeps, the one that they turned into a TV series this year, that was from the point of view of two women, both of whom are pregnant. To write from the point of view of two, here I am, middle-aged, greying, balding, grumpier by the day, and I'm trying to get inside the heads of these two women, and to talk about hugely important issues for women like marriage and pregnancy and infidelity and childlessness and all those things are hugely important. And to me, that's the great challenge. I want to challenge myself as a writer, because I hate it when people tell me that you're not allowed to write something because this is a whole lot of cultural appropriation type thing, telling writers they can't do. If you do it badly, by all means criticize it, but don't stop a writer trying. And so it's a challenge to write. Evie Cormac was probably the bigger challenge, to write a damaged teenage girl. I'm surrounded by women. I've been married, I've got 3 daughters, and I've been married for 34 years. And there's really only the dog and myself, and we've both been spayed. So that's a greater challenge. But I think that's the great beauty of being. One of my great things, when I hear one of the worst pieces of advice I've ever heard given to writers is to write what you know. Because what if you don't know very much? Is what you should write is what interests you, because that will give you the impetus to go out there and do the research necessary to inhabit that world and inhabit those characters. Because honestly, if I had to write what I know, I live on the northern beaches, it would be golfing, walking along the beach, and wife swapping. That's all I'd have. That last bit's not true.
That's a great closing comment.
No.
I think we've got time for just one more question from the floor. When we're done, there's book signing in the library, and you can also order books online. We'd also ask, if you're able to, if you can fill out the survey, either the one online or the hard copy, because the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival is an evolving concept and feedback is very important. So thank you very much. One more question. Dennis, are you putting your hand up? No.
No one wants a final question.
My friend in the blue T-shirt, I'm sure you have a question.
Thanks, Tim. Michael, got to buy a book for someone for Christmas this year. What gift do you give?
Michael, you have to buy a book for someone for Christmas this year. What gift are you giving them?
Oh, look, I'm going to suggest a couple. I'm reading, if it's a crime novel, there's a novel that I thought was going to win the Gold Dagger and got highly commended, and Good Gold, Bad Gold won it. It's a book called November Road by Lou Burney, which I think is a wonderful crime novel. I'm reading a wonderful book at the moment called Betty, set in the Ozarks. It's got a real Delia Owen feel to it, set in the Ozark type, hillbilly country. A remarkable story about a young girl. And probably the one that I would suggest if you want just something to make you feel a little bit more hopeful, there's a wonderful book called Humankind, A Hopeful History, written by a brilliant sort of psychologist and historian. And it basically, we're living in very difficult times at the moment, but it basically is an argument that we as human beings are basically good. And we always think that we're just one step removed from anarchy breaking down, and that, if things like pandemics that really, people would be dog eat dog. And we assume that if there's a plane crash, people would fight for the doors. We'd trample each other to get out. But in fact, all the evidence shows that's not what happens. And when you look at the actual events, people will sacrifice themselves and let others go first. So it is a hopeful look at humankind, which I think we need at the moment. And it's a beautifully written book.
Fantastic. Well, look, Michael, it's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure to speak with you this morning. A round of applause for Michael Robotham, please.
Thank you, Tim.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.